Hello and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. The museum is the national home for the history and heritage of the Army, a place where you can experience the story of the Army from the perspective of those who have served in it. There are many ways to support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate or become a member, where you can get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. So today, as part of our VE Day celebrations, I'm delighted to welcome our panel, Angela Findlay, Henry Montgomery, and Dr Daniel Cowling. Angela Findlay is an Anglo-German artist, author, and public speaker. She is a trustee of the Dresden Trust, and her first book, In My Grandfather's Shadow, was published by Penguin Transworld in July 2022. We are selling copies of Angela's book today in the shop upstairs, and she'll be able to sign copies for you today. So after this talk, I will be whisking her up to the shop. Henry Montgomery has worked in agriculture all his life, and for the last 32 years as a self-employed farm management consultant. He is president of the Spirit of Normandy Trust, the Portsmouth D-Day Story Trust, and the Friends of the Fusilier Museum Warwick. Dr Daniel Cowling is a historian at the National Army Museum who specialises in modern British and European history. He completed his PhD at the University of Cambridge, where he wrote his thesis on the British occupation of Germany. Today, Angela, Henry, and Daniel will be discussing the history, legacy, and remembrance culture surrounding the Second World War. Again, this event is part of the National Army Museum's VE Day celebrations, commemorating the 80th anniversary of the Victory in Europe Day. So with that all said and done, I'm now going to hand over to Daniel.
Thank you very much, Amy. Thank you very much for the kind introductions and welcome everyone to today's very special Friday Insight. It is fair to say, I think, that few historical events have resonated quite so strongly as the final stages of the Second World War in modern British culture. When we think back to 1945, we probably all conjure up those same iconic images of conga lines on Trafalgar Square, tables laden with all sorts of cakes and biscuits and fantastic goodies and street parties up and down the country. But I think it's also fair to say that when you look at the history books of this time, it's a period that was marked as well by uncertainty, trauma and loss. It was a time for reflection and remembrance as much as one of celebration. And I think today, as we look back 80 years on to these kind of momentous historical events, it makes us think about what we should do to mark the history and legacy of the Second World War, and ultimately what VE Day means to us today, 80 years on. And I'm delighted to say that to illuminate our thoughts on this conversation, joined by two very special guests, Henry and Angela, who are both, as Amy introduced, grandchildren of high-ranking officers on opposite sides during the Second World War. I think they'll both bring a unique perspective on questions of memory, history and remembrance, reflections upon their own family history and personal ties to these events, but also those broader considerations of what remembrance means today and how we might best recall and sort of restore and remember the legacy of those momentous few months at the end of the Second World War and the conflict as a whole, especially in the context and the very changed context of a world without very many surviving veterans of the war itself. So welcome to both of you, and thanks for joining us today. I'm sure it'll be a fantastic conversation. Now, to begin with, perhaps it makes sense for each of you to give us a little bit of background on your sort of illustrious grandfathers. So perhaps you could begin, Angela, just tell us a little bit about what your grandfather did up until the Second World War.
So, hello everybody. My grandfather was a German. He was a very athletic man. He was in the army from the age of about 10. He was a cadet in a Prussian military school in Schleswig-Holstein, a place called Plön. And he then, he was a very sort of skilled artillerist, and so he moved on to Schwerin, which is in the sort of northeast of Germany, and then became the leader of the artillery school in a place called Jüterbog, which is just south of Berlin. And he was a very, I think he was a kind of a poetry sort of lover. He'd write quite. He'd do crafts. He'd very athletic, very winning countless prizes in sort of long jump and high jump and swimming, tennis, that kind of thing. But really a sort of army man through and through.
Henry?
Well, grandfather's was obviously he didn't really come from a military background at all, but he came from a background, his father was a bishop of Tasmania, which is where he was brought up, and as a result was fairly wild, I think, by the time he came to this country in as age 13. At the beginning of 1900, 1901. And he eventually decided he wanted to go into the army, much against his parents' wishes, I think, and joined the army in 1908, served in India, seriously injured at the beginning of the First World War, was sort of horrified by his First World War experiences, horrified by the loss of life, horrified by the apparent absence of generals who didn't seem to be sort of connected in any way with what was actually happening on the front, and that sort of marked his future really, and he was determined to sort of master the art of battles and of warfare and of training troops and preparing them for war. So that was his sort of background, as it were, up until the beginning of the Second World War.
Well, I mean, as you say, that's where we kind of lead into in the main kind of focus of today's talk. So perhaps, I'm sure it's a story that some of us know already quite well, but just to give us a sense of what each of your grandparents did in the war itself, and in particular in those kind of few days, this time 80 years ago, what were they up to kind of around VE Day and their experiences at that time?
You want me to get right? Obviously, he was involved, grandfather was involved right from the beginning of the war, was sent over with the British Expeditionary Force into northern France, and sort of made an initial mark for himself by the way he quite successfully withdrew the troops under his command to Dunkirk and evacuated them from Dunkirk. And then was involved in training the British Army in the southeast of England, and sort of really made quite a nuisance of himself. At that point in time, Churchill described him as a little man on the make, and as a result of that, I mean, he had very clear views about how the army should be trained, and how inadequately prepared we really were, even though we were in the middle of the war. So he was very keen on training, on physical fitness, on people, on soldiers really repeating exercises until they could execute them perfectly. And that sort of obsession really annoyed his seniors. And as a result, he was largely overlooked for promotion. And then by a sort of unfortunate incident, the person who was appointed by Churchill to take over the 8th Army in North Africa died in a plane crash, and grandfather at the last moment was appointed head of the 8th Army, commander of the 8th Army, and sort of the rest is history, really. We know the story of Alamein, and then subsequently he commanded the Allied land forces in Normandy, and was intimately involved in the planning of D-Day. And 80 years ago today, he had moved his headquarters for the 26th time since landing in D-Day to Lüneburg Heath, where I will be tomorrow. He was actually, at that point in time, was very, he was physically exhausted, emotionally exhausted, and grieving the loss of a very dear person who had served with him since Alamein, one of his liaison officers who died a few days before. So he suffered, personal loss on that. So he was... The day that he took the surrender of the German forces in Northern Europe and the Netherlands and Denmark on the 4th of May, the record of how he treated the Germans was somebody who was quite grumpy. He wasn't in a good mood, and he was definitely emotionally drained.
That's very interesting. Angela, could you tell us a little bit about, I think it's probably a story we don't know quite as well, so maybe you could tell us a little bit about your grandfather.
Well, it's interesting, actually. Today is the actual day that my grandfather surrendered to the Americans in North Italy. So that's sort of where he would have been right now. It was the end of his war and the beginning of his internment as a prisoner of war. But until then, he had been, the main start of the war for him was in Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, where that was the massive invasion of Russia. And he was, a bit like your grandfather, actually, really meticulously training his men, getting their fitness levels up. They were on the border wherever, training, and for some reason not being really noticed that this massive 3 million army kind of was amassing on the borders ready to invade. And he was right in that first sort of urge, into Russia, heading on the Army Group Central, which was heading towards Moscow. And then they went kind of a wiggly way. He often talked about the ridiculous orders from the idiots above. But nonetheless, the orders before the war had even started was that this is a war of annihilation. This is not normal warfare. This is a different thing. And they were very much geared up to believe they were fighting the Bolsheviks, who were going to invade Europe if they didn't get there first. So he spent quite a long time on the Eastern Front fighting in the Battle of Volchov, which was a swampland, a horrendous battle, one of the most horrible battles. South of St. Petersburg, it was part of the 900-day siege of Leningrad. And that's where he became decorated as a general and received his Knight's Cross for, I think, extreme battleship bravery and successful military leadership. From there, he then got sent slightly from the frying pan into the fire down to Monte Cassino and in Italy, and fought the British there, and then was in kind of Italy for a while until at the very end of the war he was up in the Dolomites with some tank unit or something, and that's where he surrendered to the Americans.
Fascinating. So we get to this point in 45, and we've kind of followed the stories up there, and there's some points of comparison and some sort of contrasting aspects to these stories. And before, because I want to talk to both of you about your own kind of sense of these things, but I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about how your grandfathers thought about the war in its aftermath, and what their kind of reflection on the legacy was. And I mean, perhaps you have a particular sense of that, but as you were growing up, what did you sort of take from them and their kind of reflections on their wartime activities?
Well, it's quite difficult, that, because actually grandfather didn't really talk about his wartime experiences a lot. He was... I've read recently a comment on a little book about an interpreter who travelled with grandfather from Normandy to Germany and stayed in his headquarters until he was demobbed in early 1946. And he comments on how, in the immediate aftermath of the war, grandfather was he was sort of like a broken man. He felt, that was his observation, that he had, all his energies had been had sort of been drained out of him in terms of trying to get to the point that they got to at the end of the war, and so I think he was exhausted emotionally, physically. He apparently looked much older than he was, but so my most sort of vivid memories of talking to grandfather are really much later on in his life, when he was probably not really very well, and at that stage he just talked an awful lot about killing Germans, and it was almost as if it was. It was sort of rooted. He was horrified about the loss of life, and actually, I think he sort of carried that sort of silent burden of guilt, trauma, whatever, of living with what he'd had to live through. He didn't really talk about it, but he just talked a lot about loss of life, particularly killing Germans, and told some stories that weren't, were sort of not necessarily entirely true stories. So it was sort of, it was a very difficult, to get a handle on how he really felt. What is clear is that he felt absolutely no sense of glory in the immediate aftermath of the war. I think he said he was very much a task-orientated person. He felt this job's done, the next job is how do we, in his words, win the peace. And that's what all his focus was on. But it was from a place of being fairly sort of drained by what had happened in winning the war, as it were.
I presume in your case, Angela, the sort of legacy of Nazi Germany and what that kind of evoked in the aftermath of the war maybe lent upon your grandfather's kind of reflections.
Well, it's interesting that you say reflections, because he literally did write some reflections. It's the only bit of sort of evidence I've got of what he thought after the war, and he wrote them in the prisoner of war camp. And first of all, it was about, he was really angry at the way that all the Germans were being lumped in together as the evil baddies, and he sort of separated it out a bit, that there were the evil people at the top and the SS, and he was very clear that he wasn't one of them. He'd never joined the Nazi party, but it kind of made very difficult reading to see somebody not reflecting really properly on what had happened, particularly in the light of in the darkness of the Holocaust. But he remained a bit feisty to begin with in the defeat. But then I think it gradually dawned on him. Then he was transferred to Germany from Italy and was in the British, under the British. And there he really was humiliated, I think. He was a prisoner of war for 3 years, tried for Nazi war crimes, and actually found not guilty. But by the time he was released in March 1948, he was a completely broken man, emaciated and broken. The family didn't even recognize his voice. He was so changed. So I think that moment, it was like his downfall. It was from the moment of surrender, capitulation. It was a steep journey down. And I think from all the stories I've heard of people who knew him, and I never met him, he died a week after I was born, but they all said that for him, honor was the most important thing, that he'd been instilled with this honor, duty, obedience. These were all the Prussian things, and then the Wehrmacht values, and he had really wanted to live up to those. But when Germany's honor was broken, his honor was also broken. But I found it very difficult because of what happened in the Holocaust, what happened on the Eastern Front. You can't pretend that he wasn't part of that or didn't know, but it is also very complicated knowing that somebody who's geared, like every army officer is, to obey orders and serve your country, but what happens if the orders from above are so appalling and atrocious? So it's with real mixed, I have very mixed feelings of empathy and horror, really, I suppose,
well, it
in
kind
the
of
aftermath.
leads on to that kind of an interesting question, I think, of how you feel like the sort of inheritance you've got, the sort of family legacy has shaped your own life. So, I mean, particularly in your case, Angela, sort of your German heritage and how that's sort of impacted your experience of particularly in the UK, and like how would you sort of reflect on that now as a...
Well, I think for the first 40 years of my life, I suppose my grandfather was just a photograph of a man in a cap, German army officer, sort of on my mother's writing desk. And it was a bit of a kind of, for us, it was completely normal. That was, for me and my siblings, that was our grandfather. But anybody who came to the house and saw what to all intents and purposes just looked like a Nazi officer's face poking up from behind the typewriter, you know. It was a kind of, everybody remembers that. And I didn't know anything about the Germans. I just knew they were lovely. My relatives were lovely. The sweets were lovely. The candles on the Christmas tree were lovely. And then it was really at about the age of 12 that I began to notice that actually the Germans weren't really liked, that there was something about them that was really not good. And that's when the problems with the unconscious problems or subconscious problems began for me, that I think in a way I was made to feel shame, shame for half of me being German, and in a way I think I imposed that on myself. But then the legacy changed, and it was something that I just suppressed and didn't want to really own up to. And then it was around the age of 40 when I began to really investigate my German roots, and particularly my grandfather. And then it became a very interesting journey, such an enriching, life-enriching journey. And I've now become very grateful that I had this very knotty heritage to work with, because it's taken me to such interesting geographical, psychological, philosophical, moral problems. It's just been a very interesting heritage to have, albeit challenging.
So as you discuss very, very fascinatingly in the book, which I have read, and I would heartily recommend many others doing so. Henry, I imagine in your case, it's perhaps more of a, on the face of it anyway, it seems like maybe more of a sort of straightforward legacy. And I wonder how that's impacted you, you know, growing up with the sort of the name and the kind of the kind of reflecting on how that might have shaped the way that people have treated you, and you've experienced kind of things in the kind of shadow, whether it is that of your grandfather.
Well, I think I have a sort of, it's still this awful sort of memory of aged 5 going with grandfather to the Royal Tournament. And he was taking the salute, and we were in the royal box. And afterwards, I think this is sort of fairly tradition, usually presumably royalty in the royal box taking the salute. Anyway, it was grandfather, come down the lift, red carpet, lined with people, and all wanting to shake grandfather's hand and pat me on the head. And I was completely and utterly horrified by this experience, you know, obviously, and I think it left me sort of slightly, I don't really understand. Well, I obviously didn't understand. I mean, he was clearly very famous, and everybody idolized him, really, or that's what it felt like. So I think I sort of, to my shame, probably slightly stepped back from sort of appreciating the legacy issues of grandfather and what he'd done. And I think really what sort of triggered a sort of determination to make up for lost time was initially was on the 70th anniversary of actually the Normandy landings of D-Day, when I was invited over to Normandy. It was the first time I'd been, and I was sort of standing in for my dad, and who wasn't very well at the time, and I met veterans, and that was the sort of first time that I had I'd sort of heard firsthand how people adored him still, and it. But also, it was the first time I'd sort of got an understanding of some of just hearing some of the stories which were quietly told, with no sense of pride, and about what they had done, just ordinary people telling extraordinary stories of bravery. And I thought to myself, I need to follow up this. I need to understand what this is all about, because I'd sort of slightly blocked it out for 50 years. And so that was the beginning of my journey, really, and in terms of finding out about that. So I owe a lot to the veterans.
That's very interesting. I mean, would you say that exposure to sort of meeting veterans, that was kind of the beginning of you engaging with the history of the Second World War? Was it something are you a keen history reader? I mean,
No, I've come very late in time. I'm not. No, history wasn't my great subject. So I'm definitely a late developer on that front. But I have now read lots, simply because I sort of have had to do lots of talks, and obviously I go every year with veterans to Normandy. So yes, I have. I'm sort of definitely it has got under the skin, and I think what's really got under my skin, and this sort of touches on the sort of issue of remembrance, is something that I definitely took for granted, which was the freedoms we enjoy. And I think I spent sort of most of my adult life just entirely taking it for granted, that we could say what we wanted, do what we wanted, had freedom to move around, had freedom to worship. And I think that talking to the veterans and understanding what happened, and really understanding the horrors of war, actually, has definitely made me think this is an important subject. It's something we need to keep in the front of our minds on a regular basis, not just confined to sort of big events and sort of headline days. I had to give a talk on the 70th anniversary of the end of the war, so 10 years ago in Holland. And that was the first time I'd had to do any of these sort of official talks properly. And so I had to do quite a lot of research. And one of the things I read, one of the quotes which has sort of stuck with me, was Eisenhower talking about freedom, that freedom needs to be daily earned, daily refreshed. And so there's an individual as well as a sort of collective responsibility that I sort of have definitely, and that I feel that we need to remember, and as I say, remember the horrors of war, and not in any way glorifying it.
Mm-hmm. That's very, very profound. Angela, what would you say in terms of your kind of relationship with the history of the Second World War, and it's tied to your own family history, and then how that's kind of begun to shape your sort of understanding of remembrance, and perhaps how it's changed over time?
Yeah, well, I was somebody who grew up not thinking about war, really. I was sort of a dippy hippie artist into all these sort of alternative things, and war just wasn't really, and the Second World War didn't feature, knew very little about it, a bit like you, Henry, I didn't engage with it. And then when I realized that sort of my heritage had impacted me and it needed unpacking, I think I became also aware of the absolute horrors and futility of war, but I was also engaging very much in the other side's narrative to the one that had been given to me growing up in England. And I was aware how much bigger the story is of the Second World War than the one that we generally have in remembrance here in Britain. And I think this wanting to understand the other side of the story became really my obsession in a way. It was wanting to understand, how do ordinary people become capable of doing appalling things? And that it was very easy to sort of follow the narrative of, they were all monsters and it was just monstrous people who did it. But actually, it isn't. It is ordinary people who take one decision after the next that leads them gradually down a path. And I worked for a long time in prisons, and that was my training ground, really, for understanding how people become perpetrators, and there's always a backstory. And I think then what really dawned on me just the other day, so it's a sort of ongoing process, but for me, in a way, remembrance is about reconciliation. It's about, because war is division, it's conflict, it's two sides, there's an us and a them. And there's usually a good guy and a bad guy, and those are kind of interchangeable according to which side you're on. And I realized that I've had reconciliation modeled to me from the moment I was born. The very fact that my English father married my German mother, and I am the product of that union, which was basically love overcame the difference between their families. It was a heart gesture that is the thing that stops two sides being an us and them and in conflict and coming together, because both of their families lost under each other. They lost family members, they suffered, they bombed each other, everything. And so reconciliation has been the focus for me with, yeah.
I think it's perhaps interesting. It struck me, both of you, I mean, obviously, Angela, you've got this tie to Germany and the kind of understanding of perhaps a different culture of remembrance there. And Henry, you talked about how you've kind of gone away with veterans groups and you've been to Holland and you're going to Lüneburg today or tomorrow, and today. And so I just wonder if, as we start to talk about this kind of culture of remembrance and this sort of overriding sort of theme of today's discussion, if either of you kind of have any takeaways from the sort of remembrance cultures that take place elsewhere that maybe aren't as familiar to all of us in the room here today, and maybe things that you maybe think that we could kind of look to and sort of adopt in some way. Angela?
Yeah, well, I've really looked into Germany's culture of remembrance, which until recently wasn't really known, and it really started in the 90s and gathered momentum. But they have a culture that obviously they couldn't build any memorials to their soldiers, so there were no memorials built after the Second World War, and it became all about, after a period of suppression, it became all about remembering those that Germany had destroyed and killed. And their memorial cultures is really about taking a long, hard look at Germany's culpability. And it's all about trying to apologize and atone and prevent the same thing happening again. And their memorials, when you've got traditional memorials, which we all know, they're generally a plinth. Something is raised on a plinth, usually something that you look up with honor and gratitude, and you want to remember this event. Germany's memorials are all, often they disappear into the ground or they're on the ground. They're all about loss and the horror of discrimination and death, really. And the big point is that they don't want memorials to do the remembering for us. Their memorials, because they're transient or disappearing, or they're really interesting. It's really worth looking at their counter-memorials culture. That's what it's called. The whole aim is to put the memory, the act of remembering, back into the people. That's where the activity of remembering should occur, rather than allowing a memorial to do the remembering for us. So it's a daily thing. And their culture is really about knowing the truth, really looking, not flinching in any way. It's quite astonishing how their memorials are really pointers to their darkest moment and to their national shame.
So that's another idea of kind of remembrance as a, whatever the context, that kind of is an ongoing process, a daily kind of repetition, that sort of thing.
Mm. Well, I sort of think behind your question is, a little bit how do we do it here in this country, and therefore what perhaps we can learn from. I mean, from other countries, I've done sort of, obviously I've been to France many times with veterans, and the thing that completely stands out, the way the French, and they were obviously, I only got experience of Normandy, but they were occupied, and so they totally understand, what the difference between, occupation was then and what their freedom is now, and they've been incredibly good at passing that on down the generations, and without exception, all the events we go to in Normandy, there are school children. So it's sort of embedded in their culture, really. Particularly in Normandy, I can't speak for any other part of France, but certainly in Normandy, my experience is that the children really understand, what freedom means. So I think that's one of my experiences. The other experience I had back in 2019 was I went for the first time in my life to Alamein. They have to commemorate the in that case there was the what was it, the 75th, I suppose it was, anniversary of Alamein, and in Egypt the embassies of the British embassy, the German embassy and the Italian embassy worked together to organise the commemoration at the ceremonies, and they rotate around each other's cemeteries. So the events, one year it's concentrated in the year I went happened to be time for the British, but I thought that was a fantastic model of reconciliation, actually, and acknowledging that actually we need to work together and acknowledge together what happened. And I think if you were critical a little bit of what we do in this country, I think we don't do that so well, I don't think. I sort of sense that you just find the word celebration creeping into the events more than commemoration, and, honestly, there was nothing to celebrate. There was a lot to be thankful for about the end of the war, but so I think there's a danger that in that we can be slightly glorifying the war and putting ourselves up as sort of we won the war type of approach. So I think that's dangerous. So I think we could do things better. Some of the high-profile sort of events could be more inclusive, I think. I think we definitely need to spend much more time engaging with young people. I think museums have a role to play in that. I'm sure you do that anyway here. Certainly other museums I'm involved with do a lot of that. We're going with a group of well, they're already on their way there, but to Lunenburg, we're going, I'm joining them this evening. There's a group of 10 students, A-level students, sixth form students, and they're going to meet students from Germany and Holland and Denmark. And I think that sort of model of sort of, changing, interacting with each other at a young age and talking about it. I've read their speeches, actually, and they've definitely got the message. Well taught by my nephew, I think. But they have got the message, and it was really interesting reading what they're saying about and the point that I made earlier about daily remembering and not taking for granted the freedoms that we've got that we so easily do.
So do you think that kind of, looking to involve kids in particular is a kind of a fundamental part of how we adapt to a world of remembrance when there really are very few living veterans of either world wars left? Do you think that is kind of the core of how we might adapt to that change?
Well, I think the responsibility is for every single citizen to take the subject seriously and to be able to pass that on as well and to talk about it. And I think we sort of tend to try and sort of brush it under the carpet a bit and sort of just get on with life. So I think that's the bit about daily refreshing, daily earning the freedoms that we've got. I think Eisenhower, in the second part of that quote, was that if we don't do that, like a flower, our freedoms will wither. A flower without water, it will wither and die. And so I think we're in troubled times at the moment, and I think we need to think carefully and talk more about a culture of remembrance and making it part of our daily life. So I'm not anti-remembrance. I just think we're not. We need to be collective, all of us. But I think also we need to encourage younger people to be more involved in the.
What's your sense, Angela, in terms of the future of remembrance?
I mean, I agree with a lot with what Henry has just said. There are quite a few things. I think, on the one hand, we do the ceremonies very well, and the rituals and visually, it's all very impressive and very, very moving. I think what's quite important is to include a far broader narrative of history. So not just to have the sense of there were baddies and goodies, but to bring it into a much more lived experience of how conflict begins, because it all starts with us going sort of, well, they're bad and I'm good. That's where the whole of the Second World War really started. So I think I would bring more of the psychology of how conflict arises into the classrooms, into young people's experiences, so that you can nip things in the bud before they even develop. I had a really good thought just before, and it's gone out of my head, and it will come back. I was also thinking that what I've learned from Germany is that self-reflection. I mean, patriotism is pretty hollow if you only look at the glory and the honor and the good things about your history. I think we could do with a bit more self-reflection in this country, about where things weren't so good. And I know your book talk, which is also very excellent, is, it takes a slightly more critical look at the bits where we didn't do so well. So when we, for example, talk about, when we remember the Second World War, it's very easy to think, well, we triumphed over evil, and the evil were the Nazis over there. But actually, anti-Semitism, which of course is true, I don't want to negate that, but anti-Semitism was pretty rife in this country as well before the war. We took in 70,000 Jews before the war broke out, and just 10,000 when the whole Holocaust was going on. We made decisions not to bomb the railways leading to the camps, even though the Russians did it very successfully. That we did know about the Holocaust, and maybe if we just reflected a little bit, what more could we have done to stop the horror sooner? Then I think the rounded story that war is awful, everybody makes mistakes. We unite then a bit more in the remembrance, in the horror with our fellow Europeans. We can share the loss that everybody had. We can share the shame, and really, I think, just to finish, there were two pictures where I thought of sort of reconciliation. One was when for the 100th centenary of the First World War, we got the President of Germany, Steinmeier, to lay a wreath at the cenotaph. A lone German going and laying the wreath on our most important Remembrance Day, and this was hailed as a massive act of reconciliation. I felt quite uncomfortable. I thought, well, this is very one way. It's very sort of, right, Germans, you can go on apologizing and feel that everything that you did wrong. Whereas in France, Macron and Merkel took hands and laid a wreath together, holding hands and hugged. And I just thought those two different pictures, and I would love Britain to do a bit more hugging. of our of our former enemies, and bring in that sort of that we all are human beings 80 years on.
Sure. Well, I think on quite a difficult and very thought-provoking topic, that's quite a nice place to end it on. The idea of us all kind of doing a bit more hugging seems like a good thing for the world. I will hand over now to the audience. I'm sure many of you have got questions, and one of my colleagues has got a microphone. She will come round and just sort of hand it around. So
yes,
please put your
I
hand up.
do have a microphone, so I'll be round, I promise.
Angela, Henry, thank you very much for such a powerful and insightful discussion. My name is Paul Brannigan. I'm a retired teacher, and I still get to talk to teenagers. I also have a quasi-military background, and I have lived in Germany. The difficulties I have with some teenagers are they live in the modern world. So may I ask you, putting aside some of the distressing personal reflections that you've already discussed, could you perhaps share some ideas about what your grandfathers would have thought of the basic merits and ethics of maintaining armies?
Of maintaining?
Of maintaining armies.
Oh my gosh.
Well, I do know that grandfather was very keen on maintaining the army. One of the things that he felt extremely strongly after the Second World War was that our army wasn't fit for purpose. And so he continued. In fact, if you read his memoirs, one of his chapters is titled, "I Made a Nuisance for Myself in Whitehall." And I think he was probably pretty disastrous as head of the army, in which he was between when he left Germany in 1946 for a couple of years. So, but he was very clear that whilst Angela's absolutely right, we need to do much more hugging. We can't get away from the fact that we live in a world that is not entirely straightforward. We don't necessarily can control what other people... I mean, we just have to look at what's happened in Ukraine. And if we weren't able to support Ukraine, which we've not done brilliantly well, in my view, but if we weren't able to support Ukraine, what would have happened and where would that have ended? So I think we can't get away from the fact that we need a defence capability. That's my personal opinion, and I'm 100% sure that it would have been grandfather's opinion, but we need a good one.
Can I, just so that we answer more questions, can I just say, yes, I agree?
Yeah, that's fine.
Right, we've got lots of hands up, so that's good.
Yes.
I don't know your name, the lady.
Angela.
Angela. I think the issues in 1939, when we declared war on Germany, were quite clear, and that the Nazi Germany was bad. I mean, I think you were implying that, you know, we weren't fighting something that was really very bad.
I didn't mean to imply that at all.
That's
No, we
what you said. Okay.
yeah.
Well, just one thing. Also, Henry, I understand your grandfather was very unpopular with the Americans. And I just wondered if, because he upset quite a few of them, he also upset Churchill. I wondered if that, did you ever talk about that? And did you ever sort of experience that?
Well, he did upset the Americans. I think what's true to say is during the Second World War, at a high level, there was quite a lot of upsetting going on because, understandably, you know, grandfather was in charge of the Allied land forces planning for D-Day. He was very protective of his part of the plans. Tedder was very protective of the Air Force and the people under his command. Ramsey likewise, and everyone was protecting their own, and clearly the Americans were protecting them. The Americans also had an issue that, you know, half of America didn't really want the Americans to be involved, and so there was a sort of political issue there as well. So I think there was a lot of people upsetting each other. If you read the correspondence between Eisenhower and grandfather, I think well, Patton didn't live long enough for them to have fallouts after the war, but they were two extremes characters that were never, ever going to get on or see eye to eye on anything. Bradley and grandfather actually did get on quite well. Eisenhower, I've met Susan Eisenhower, been with her many times in Normandy, talked to her about our relative, both our grandfathers, and she describes, her grandmother, Mamie, actually Monty being the favourite guest at the White House when he went. So they actually, and the same with Churchill. I mean, if you read some of the stories in latter years, they might have had hard words to say, protecting their own interests, but they actually fundamentally understood where they were coming from, particularly someone like Eisenhower, who was a wise diplomat and understood exactly what was going on between them.
If I could just say that to the first part of your question, that I absolutely didn't want to minimize how awful Nazi Germany was in any way. That would be, but having really looked into the other side, where they were coming from, you understand that in any conflict there are really two sides. What they saw as bad and what they were fighting against was their perspective. So it's not quite, all I'm trying to imply is that it's not always quite as clean cut as we think from the perspective of one side. That's all. That
Sorry, we're just moving on to another question. Thank you.
From the point of view of reconciliation, one of the things I've been struck about my grandchildren being at school here in England is that it is a bit more like Henry said about celebration. We won. There is little mention, it seems, and it feels to me that reconciliation could be better achieved if it was, by some recognition of who else was with us. I mean, we had an empire who were fighting with us, many of whose troops travelled thousands of miles to die in Europe. And there were other nations like Poland, and there was a French division in Italy, and some sort of reconciliation of all that would be helpful, I think, in the sort of public discussion of the war.
I agree totally with that, and I really think, for example, the war wouldn't have been won without the Russians and without the huge sacrifice they made, and I just think the conflicts which happen today, many of them are the result of unprocessed trauma, unprocessed all this going on, and it arrives, and Israel and Palestine don't need to go into all the political conflicts now, but I do think that would be a real act of reconciliation to acknowledge where there was also good in other sides. Yeah.
Hi. I actually know Daniel from university, Cambridge. I don't know if you remember me, but yeah. Hi, it's good to see you again. So just a couple of points. You talk about reconciliation with other countries. So my father studied in the Soviet Union in the 70s. So obviously at all the parades, there would have been a lot of veterans in Moscow. And one thing that struck me, the first point is one thing that struck me is in Russia, the commemoration of the war was very, very different to here. It's more about the triumph of good over evil at the time of communism versus Nazism, and obviously the triumph of Russia over Germany. And that's had kind of horrific consequences now because the Ukraine war, part of the reason they fight it, because I actually have family in Ukraine who had to flee the war, that they justify it by saying we are killing Nazis today. So they're using that to justify the horrific crimes that are happening right now. And the second point is, in India, the Second World War isn't viewed in quite the same light. So everything post-1948 is commemorated. But anything before, they view it as kind of like they were coerced to fight for Britain. So in India, people get a lot of blank stares. Like, people don't really care as much about the First and Second World Wars as much as post-1948. And for that reason, there's been efforts to discuss it. But how do you answer those two questions, particularly the first one, which I feel is more pertinent to all the issues we're facing today?
Sorry, who was that question directed to?
Both of you, sorry. About reconciliation and about not celebrating, the Second World War.
I think the first question about reconciliation, we've already said, but I think remembrance and reconciliation must go hand in hand. The question is how we can achieve that, and everything. Obviously, in the context of Russia-Ukraine, that's really quite difficult to do at the moment, probably impossible. So, but you know, I think Angela's point is what if you go back in time, what's behind that? You know, and acknowledging some of the causes and the problems or the things that weren't dealt with properly that have resulted in what has happened, and that would probably be true of how the Second World War actually happened. So I think there's a need to be honest. I think, and that's your point, Angela, about there is a sort of, I mean, you know, basically war has to be a collective failure of people to actually and of countries to engage properly with each other. So how we resolve that, I'm not sure I have the answers at all. But I think, you know, we can start at an individual level, that's for certain. And that's, I think, probably all we can do. So I haven't
Coming
answered the
round
second question.
with the microphone, I promise.
Hi, such an interesting talk, thank you so much. And just really struck by this idea of different kinds of memorials, Angela. That was really interesting. So I started thinking about what might we memorialise in a different way in this country, and thought about the withdrawal from Afghanistan and possibly some sort of memorial recognising the Afghans who died in that withdrawal, who were working with British forces, something that's really troubled a lot of people who served there. And then the more I thought about it and wondered what it would look like and how it would reflect that darker side, the more I wondered about how that would impact on things like army recruitment, because people actually cherish the glorious feeling, and that gets people to sign up for it. And whether once you start acknowledging the darker side, you then have a pressure away from being able to get people to engage.
That's really interesting, because, of course, after the Second World War, Germany was a pacifist country, and I think it's been so hard for them to do, for example, we're saying now that, yes, they've got to pay more for defence, which is probably absolutely right, but it was so hard for them to re-engage, for example, sending tanks to Russia, or to Ukraine to fight against Russia. You can just imagine the collective trauma of that memory, the horror of that memory. So I think you raise a really, really interesting point of how do you then galvanize people to be patriotic, and when you're focusing more on loss and horror. I think, though, the one difference that I can sort of think on the spot is that Germany's memorials are more about the Holocaust, which wasn't strictly the warfare of the... I mean, it was like, it was all entwined and part of it, but that was an additional level of utter horror and atrocity that wasn't... So that's what they're focusing on rather than the war. But they had to pass a law in Germany that soldiers who are primed to obey, are allowed to disobey orders if it is morally wrong. They can't disobey it because they just don't feel like it, or, you know, can't be bothered or something like that. But if it really goes against their morality, if they get moral injury from what they are being asked to do, they can do that. So I think we'd have to kind of rethink the army a little bit as well, which is really interesting. I'm going to really think about that. Thank you for a very interesting question.
Any more questions? Yes.
Angela, thank you. Vielen Dank. My late fiancée was German, a great Anglophile, but she had a huge sense of shame at Germany's conduct during the war. My impression now is that the young German people really couldn't give a fig. It is ancient history for them. Do you feel that they should be, curious expression, made to remember the behaviour, well, the Second World War, and in particular, some of the bad behavior of the Nazis?
Thank you. I actually wrote my last blog on exactly this issue, because I think now probably over 90% of Germans weren't alive in the war. And so for them, the war is becoming a distant thing. And they have had, generations up till now, they have really had their noses rubbed in the education system. It comes at all angles, not just in history lessons, what happened, because it's about ethics, it's morality, it's psychology, all these things, they're taught about it. And many of them, this shame, and this is something that I go into because that is what I felt, and it is an absolutely insidious feeling to feel shame, not only national shame, but shame is for something you are, it's not guilt for what you've done. So people get those words muddled up a bit, and the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, the far-right party, buoyed up by Elon Musk, are sort of saying, enough with this German guilt, we've done enough. And lots of young people are going to ride on the back of that. Yes, why should we? We weren't even alive. That's really dangerous because then all this misinformation, disinformation comes in. But where I think we can help is for and 75% of young Germans think that their families were resistors in the Second World War. Well, but that just shows how utterly painful it is to face a past as horrific as Germany's past, where pretty much everybody was implicated and as being complicit. It's really hard and difficult. So again, this is where I would like Britain to reach out and make it, we remove the shame, we remove the, for these generations. It was appropriate at one point, but not for so that young Germans can look at their family pasts with honesty. Look, see, yes, there were Nazis in my family. Yes, there were horrors in that, but also that my grandmother was raped. She was one of the 2 million rapes. So that the stigma is removed from it, so that they can look and own their family past. And then the crucial point, take responsibility. Take responsibility that these things don't happen again. And they do really try to remain vigilant, but that is dissolving in the next generations. Many of them, it just, with the death of most people, contemporary witnesses, it's a real danger. But I think Britain can help if we really offer that space, a safer space for people to look back without the stigma of shame.
Right, we have run over.
Can I just sort of say one thing, to follow up on that? I mean, as I've said already, my sister and I, together with some students, have been invited to Lüneburg Heath, and all the sort of email correspondence that we've had from the people who are inviting us is about wanting to give thanks for this moment in history that resulted in the rebirth of a democratic Germany. So I think there might well be, people who are wanting to bury it, but equally there are other people, like the kind people who've asked us to come to Lüneburg and commemorate on Sunday evening exactly that. So it's not lost, I don't think. I think there is a clear number of people wanting to.
So we've got time for one last question.
Okay, so just bringing together quite a few points have been made. We seem to have gone through some transitions from remembrance, from the victory stroke capitulation through remembering, and I wondered what the next stage is, and you've intimated what that might be, but it's something about not being passive, for this being active. We're still repeating exactly the same failures that have led to atrocities and warfare in the past, and it's that personal active sort of accountability for the future in some way needs to take flight, and you and I guess all of us are very much can be part of that to energise the next generation to try and stop repeating what's going on. So there's not really a question, just a statement that it has to be active, not passive in terms of remembrance, history. It's about the future and being active.
I think that's a great summing up statement. Thank you.
I'm out of a job.
Daniel can go home now. So thank you so much first to our panel, Angela and Henry, for speaking so well, so poignantly, raising some amazing points, and to Daniel for ably chairing today. And I'd like to thank you guys in our audience, in person and online, for joining us. Just to say that if you've enjoyed this talk, please come back. Also, I'm happy to plug our YouTube channel, which has some fantastic talks that have been brought up today in our Q&A section. So Tim Grady, Burying the Enemy, talking about British and German burying their enemy war dead, and John Conker talking about the British colonial African army in the Second World War. So if you're interested in those topics, go to our YouTube channel. If you're online, like, comment, subscribe to hear more about it. In person, maybe consider becoming a member, where you can come to far more talks like this. Carrying on with VE commemoration, on the 15th of May, we have Kate Vigers talking about her new book, The Women of SOE. We also have on the 30th of May, author Victoria Walsh talking about Rena Stewart, translator of Hitler's Will and Bletchley Park Girl. So if you're interested in coming to those talks, they're all on our website where you can find out more. So if you'd like to join me in thanking Angela, Henry and Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you.